The following podcast is rated I for intellectual. It contains jargonistic terminology that may be too stimulating for some listeners. Topics discussed are approached with an emphasis towards educational fair use. Critical thinking is advised.
Hello, this is Dr. Garrett Castleberry, Associate Professor and Program Director of Communication, Media, and Ethics at Mid-America Christian University. I'm here with our special episode for our lecture podcast. Special topics in media, if I can reuse that word multiple times. Our emphasis in this podcast changes themes each season. We're in our second season now, and the focus point of this series is to look at media and mass media and explore these texts, whether it's for their narrative value or perhaps their cultural value, maybe even the persuasive angles that texts communicate to us or mass communicate to us. And this season, our emphasis has been on the medium of comics. And so in looking at the medium of comics, we have singled out a case study text and used Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns from 1986 as our master text here. This is a book that was released in serialized fashion in 4 parts, and we spent the first 4 episodes of our lecture series looking at each book. And now we're going to broaden the scope of this masterwork and look at the legacy of The Dark Knight Returns. And what we mean by that is the extensions that this book created, not only for the character in comics, but also as a part of the growing genre of superhero cinema. And it's certainly a large and extended legacy that continues to extend. We're in essence a continuation of the peak of superhero cinema, although we're probably starting to kind of move into a distilled plateau period in light of a recent industry shutdown in conjunction with the COVID-19 pandemic. And that's certainly a rich conversation thread all its own. We're likely to get into it and many other topics. But first, let me introduce my, I've decided I can't say partner in crime and dynamic duo team member, because it's insinuating both the hero side and the villain side of the coin here, Scott. But I'm joined, as always, by Scott McMurray, chair of the School of Business at MacU, and he's here to offer us some Bat insights and yet another teaser in the form of your host site. Where are you hosting from today?
Not in the Bat Cave this time, but on set at the scene of the movie now filming, or now being worked on in the background, The Bat-Mania, now set to be released in October of 2021. I think it was originally going to be released in June of 2021. Matt Reeves directing this, and starring Robert Pattinson, who has become a big name from his, I will say, lowly origins in the Twilight Saga, something that I admit I've never actually watched. My father, who was 85 years old, watched them because he likes movies about werewolves, and he liked them. So apparently it's got some crossover, but
so you're
serious work.
Like so many comics of yesteryear, you're appealing to the teen demographic here, right? Robert Pattinson, teen heartthrob of the YA novel adaptation of the Twilight series. Not unlike Batman, he went into hiding for a period of about 10 years, where he has become a rigorous method actor on the indie scene, right? The independent film circuit. And he's, as I joked before, he's working essentially a Nick Cage style workload, right? When you're in independent films, you're churning out a lot more because there are fewer of those production restrictions and a lot more of that kind of auteur ensemble, right? Smaller sets, smaller crews, more focused on character and acting, and he's developed quite the reputation. But in over the last couple of years, he's beefed back up, right? He's hit the bat gym and got in shape for a turn at what is being advertised as the Batman, right? So we're given, which speaks to his age, an origin story that we'll get into because it links to Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns. I'll go ahead and say Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns was such a massive success for DC Comics. It changed the game immediately. This wasn't one of those texts where you come back to it like a Moby Dick and, the author's dead by the time it becomes, renowned. This was an instant success. It rejuvenated the character, and that's exactly our discussion thread. But by the very next year, Frank Miller did go back to the well and was extremely successful with the follow-up. However, in a precursor to George Lucas, he went back to the origins instead of moving the character forward. And Miller's next project for DC was Batman Year One, which is a clear influence for this direction of this Pattinson, this younger Batman vehicle. But also, let's compare covers here. I have with me maybe a graphic novel version of Year One, and note, of course, it's a very thin. It was only 4 shorter issues, more of a novella style. But look at the color scheme, right? Are they clearly suggesting, DC, that is Warner Brothers, to their audience that you're in for a Miller-esque gritty origin treat with the Batman? What do you think, Scott?
Well, sure. I think that as we've discussed, I think that we moved from a less complicated view of Batman as a straightforward superhero with Miller into this very complex, very confusing, not always good, I think, but very challenging look at a uber violent, psychologically complex character. Comics that did not shy away from not only real world issues, but real world violence, and required people to sort of be more morally invested than you would be in a typical superhero adventure comic from only a few years before. And DC, knowing a good thing when they saw it with Miller, I think started to move other production that way. I was just, I hope that we'll get a chance to talk about the Joker, because, the treatment of the Joker, who had become sort of a goofy character, certainly on TV versions, because you can't be so violent with children. We get a deeply disturbed, purely psychotic, ultra-violent, mass-murdering Joker. And I think that character continues to be sort of a focus of fascination for comic book authors, including Alan Moore, who did The Watchmen. In '88, he does The Killing Joke. I have not read it yet, but researching for this podcast, I'm like, that's next on my list, because it is a Joker-centric series by the same person who did The Watchmen, only 2 years after, and probably the year after Year One, or maybe the same year as Year One. And so it's, I think sometimes the fascination with the Joker character has equaled that of Batman, and has not always led to good things. But it is, I think we do see the entry of the graphic novel into an adult world of realistic consideration of these problems.
You're really tapping into something important here, and in true fragmented narrative context, we'll bounce around between themes. I think we've started with the most recent example, Matt Reeves' upcoming The Bat-Man film, a film which was delayed. Its production was delayed due to the COVID-19 shutdowns, due to the global pandemic. They were filming in, I think, in some London studios currently, and only about a quarter of the way through filming. So already that movie has been postponed. You know, for those, I think we're all pretty familiar with certain patterns in the Hollywood industry, in cinema in particular, and we have certain seasons where different types of films are released, and we view that summer season as that optimal popcorn movie season where we're just out to have fun and see some big, you know, bells and whistles. And this was a movie that would have kicked off next summer, and I've noticed in they're constantly reshuffling release schedules. It's now scheduled for a moody October release, which is usually a dead period, to be honest. They'll dump cheap horror movies into that slot, which are highly profitable because they're cheap. But usually you don't see a lot of high-profile movies coming out that early in the fall. Typically around that first weekend in November is where they kick off the winter holiday movie season, which is the second biggest time of the year for that industry. But
September, October, the kids are back in school and the weather turns bad.
No,
and so it's, you know, you don't necessarily want to schedule your blockbuster release there. People don't have time and they may not have access. So.
Well, let's talk about cultural crossovers. I mean, that time of year, August, September, the dumping ground for cinema, along with February. This is a time where football starts again, where people are ready to get outdoors. The heat breaks a little bit, or at least, you know, we're taking vacation times in August before people go back to school, before the work. And so all of these cultural rituals that tie in are significant. These are economic factors, right? This is a savvy industry that thinks and acts and practices you know, economic policy just like you would see in other private sectors of the country. But you mentioned Joker, and it's worth noting right off the bat, the last two, excuse me, it wasn't the last two, but the two most prominent depictions of Joker have been able to shatter the invisible barrier and a definite barrier that exists between popcorn cinema and legitimate, you know, Hollywood film, which
Academy
is
Awards.
Academy and the Academy Awards. So two of the last three Joker performances went on to win, you know, receive that ultimate industry, you know, fist bump and pedestal recognition for the Joker performances. They outdrew, in essence, the presence of a Batman or Bruce Wayne figure, and highly profitable, mind you. So we've seen this kind of shift with DC fans and DC methods that move toward not only anti-hero figures, but outright villains in the center, like we did with Suicide Squad, or the incredibly disturbed presentation of Batman and Superman versus Batman, or is it the other way around, Batman versus Superman? There was a comic of that nature, and then the film, right? And I you know, it's a juxtaposition, and I confuse the two, but that's kind of Batman's superhero opposite, not unlike the way that Joker is his opposite in terms of Gotham and that good versus evil opposition, which is so central to not only superhero storytelling, but mythology, and Western mythology in particular. Dualistic opposition is a fundamental source of knowledge and organization in Western cultures, whereas sometimes in Far Eastern cultures you might see alternative takes, more cyclical based mythologies and that sort of thing. Well, let's back up and look at some of the additional influences, because you've mentioned one that's important. Immediately in the mid 80s, after the success of Dark Knight Returns, we have, as I mentioned, a prequel follow-up, Batman Year One. The next year, it's 1987, and this was another home run. In fact, I think it's enhanced by the more collaborative effort. If I'm not mistaken, some of the artwork was by, you know, David, Mazzucchelli, and so you have a little bit cleaner edges to the pictures, a little more classical look in that book, and I think that makes it a strong readerly work as well. It has that aesthetic value, but you know, Miller's artwork, as we've suggested in the past, is controversial at times, right? And I want to get into a little bit of that controversy momentarily, but before I do, we're talking about the 1980s, and so let's go 80s, 90s, and 2000s. I think that would be most helpful roadmap for us to talk about influences of The Dark Knight. So the immediate influences on the comic scene, right? And we've been talking about that already. And on the comic scene, you have the year one, but it spreads to other writers and works as well, right? They kind of take the baton, even though Dark Knight Returns is what we consider outside of continuity. That it was considered an Elseworlds tale. That was the safety net with which they could sort of push the boundaries of what was going on in the story, because many of those representations or depictions of heroes would be controversial, to say the least. These are iconic characters that are heavily protected by their corporate owners, and they mean a lot, and they generate a lot of revenue, but also, you know, cultural value. And so that distinction was necessary. But year one,
just a quick mention of the way this ties into marketing. These characters are brands, and you have to be careful. You know, as it turns out, the Batman brand has stayed significantly relevant by adapting and changing, but you know, other characters maybe not so successfully. There's a lot of money, many people employed based on being able to sell the graphic novels, and then just think about how that multiplies into cinema. And so you don't lightly change what those characters are about or what they stand for if you're part of the organization that makes money from them. So it is a brand management problem, very clearly.
That's excellent. And let's remember that prior to this, by Miller's own words, and I watched multiple interviews with him in anticipation of this episode that we put together, and just to, you know, provide a citational reference point, there was a pair of New York Comic Con panels that he shared on in, I believe, 2015 and 2016, in which much of the same content was covered in each. But he emphasized, you know, Batman was in the dumps. Batman was not a popular character. It had hit a stalemate. It had that residual effect of the Batman TV show of the 60s that was out of fashion, right? That had moved from pastiche to kitsch, you know, in the popular eye. And then you had those adapting into the 1970s. You had those very, you know, those 2D animated cell cartoons, Super Friends, where Batman was once again a wholesome, childlike figure, right? Because he was being sold to kids, to the youth, the young youth. And this was a dramatic turn. This was a gamble. And it did pay off. Now, I think our students in their weekly journals were astute to point out that issue one, book one, catches us way off guard as readers. They're not anticipating the kind of level of maturity that this book is suggesting, and this absolutely was a game changer. This was a paradigm shift, along with Watchmen, along with some similar works in the mid 80s, to kind of move comics into what is colloquially referred to as the grim and gritty era of superhero storytelling. So you had follow-up works like you mentioned, The Killing Joke by Alan Moore, but we also had Jim Starlin write A Death in the Family. And A Death in the Family, in continuity, actually fulfilled the reverse prophecy of The Dark Knight Returns by controversially, historically, allowing readers to choose the fate of not Tim Drake, of Jason Todd, the second Robin's fate. And by a thin margin, they elected that he would meet a fatal end. And that became a crucial story point that haunted Batman throughout continuity in the 90s and into the 2000s. The death of Jason Todd was a real sort of gothic storytelling moment that gave that character.
Think how bold that experiment is, and how telling it is. You know, producers of all kinds of other products might be well advised to think about doing something like this themselves. It turns out the readership didn't want Robin, or at least they didn't want Robin in the way that he had traditionally been presented, as sort of the ward and sort of the sort of taking a son role to Batman's stern father. And I think that generation realized it diluted both the Robin character and the Batman character. It didn't let us explore the kind of psychological drama that people obviously wanted to address with Batman, because to do that, he has to become the kind of person who's not really suitable to have some, you know, to have a ward maybe. And so it's, you know, and we talked before in a previous episode about how cringy the Robin character had become to people, say, of my generation, where, you know, it's just, it wasn't a good cultural fit anymore. You know, he didn't wear any pants, and that was just, and he was, you know, and he played second fiddle and lived in the mansion.
Well, and Miller's keenly aware of this. This is why his Robin is, you know, brandishing a bean flip.
But just even in Miller's interpretation, you know, ultimately we have to kill Robin off to restart, I guess. But you know, even in Miller's interpretation, he realizes, I mean, just making that a young woman instead of a young man relieves a bunch of that tension. You know, makes it a lot more readable for his contemporary audience, I think.
We talked about that single splash page. It's one of the first full page panels that we get in The Dark Knight Returns, where Bruce has kind of awakened in full force in the cave, and he's been rescued by Carrie. So it's not necessarily the first, but I believe book 2, when she's hugging him right in the dark, and he's kind of standing there sort of declothed, right? It is worthy of critical reflection, to say the least. But it's a beautifully rendered panel in splash page, and Miller referenced that specific page as, for him, the emotional peak of the book in his mind, and it has a lot to do with these characters, what they need, the absence in their life, and maybe the presence that they provide for one another, as well as how it links up to the overall mission, and maybe the troubled nature of you know, superheroes when we start to think about them too much and take it too serious.
Well, and not to overstate the metaphor, but it's a visual representation of a new generation embracing the Batman, because that's where Batman was at. It was at a place where the new generation, specifically people my age and a little younger, just were not ready to have more of the, you know, of the kind of Batman that it really controlled the representation all the way back to the TV serial. That was the big cultural connection that everybody made to Batman, and it was not serious enough. It was not adult enough to carry the weight of anything other than moralistic tales that you would have seen back in the Golden Age. So it's, you know, I can see why Miller would feel that that's the emotional center of The Dark Knight Returns, because it is a visual representation of a new generation literally embracing the character, and so we find another way that we can connect to Batman for younger people, instead of them feeling like every time they read a Batman comic they are reading their grandpa's comic, you know.
Right? Yeah, funny books, as my grandpa used to reference them. Let's talk about the influences outside of comics, and it's going to allow us a nice transition to talking about cultural influences in the 1980s into the 1990s, and that is 1989's top grossing film, Tim Burton's original Batman, right? Sometimes referred to as Batman '89 because there are multiple features titled Batman. But Batman 1989 was this cultural tour de force. It sort of captured the popular imagination that year. It was definitely capitalized on heavily. So you had just the gates swung wide open. Everything from toys to merchandising. This was at that era, that about 5 to 7 year era where sports collecting and cards just went through the roof before they went belly up. And I can recall Batman, the trading cards, right, from Topps, or there were other competing brands at the time, maybe Upper Deck and that sort of thing. But I believe it was Topps that had the Batman cards with the chewing gum inside. And so you just have this kind of, this is that demonstration of capitalism just raking its arm across the cultural landscape and impressing a generation of youth.
Well, by '89, you've had 12 years of Star Wars showing us how it's done, right? Building an empire in marketing that dwarfs their income from the movies, and people realizing that, companies realizing, media companies realizing, producers realizing that there's so much more to be made off the movie by extending it into product. That collecting becomes legitimized. Batman '89, if I'm not mistaken, was the 4th Batman movie, maybe, going all the way back to the 40s. This movie behind me is the 17th Batman movie. So, this is from '89 forward, you have an explosion, not just of Batman, other superheroes we could talk about, but the whole idea of bringing this character to the cinema, to the movie screen over and over again in reinterpreting is a lot about how we can capitalize on the merchandise that comes out of this and keep interest sustained across generations. Yeah.
Well, and to back up, this is often seen as the kickoff point for the modern era of these decades of superhero films. But there was Superman the movie that came out at the end of the 1970s, I believe 2 years ago, it was 78 or 79 after Star Wars. And like the original Star Wars, it's very hopeful. It's very optimistic about people, about society, about our heroes. And so it has that shiny aspect to it and its mythology. And this flips that a little bit. We're given that darker, brooding character, right? A tortured soul with a dark origin. Not only that, but this is a movie where, here we go again, in its first, large scale production, the Joker not only steals every scene he's in, he gets top billing. It's 2-time Academy Award winner Jack Nicholson. And so this kicks off
this idea of the bad person being more interesting goes all the way back to some epic literature that that it's oh Lord, I've lost my mind. What's the epic Renaissance piece about about Adam and Eve getting kicked out of the garden? Not Prometheus Unbound, but I can't. Anyway, it's often one of the critiques of that is often that the devil is by far the most interesting character, because it's kind of hard to write God. You can't do, he doesn't have any conflict. He's God. And same thing with Superman, right? What kind of conflict does Superman really have? He's all powerful. He's wise. He's good. So the only conflict can come from the outside, and then from people that are bound to fail in their attempts to defeat him. Whereas the devil, the tortured character, is a lot more like us in some ways. Doesn't know what to do, is might fail in The Dark Knight Returns is getting old, knows that they can't do what they mean to do. This is killing you, isn't it? You're looking.
I have that book sitting on the shelf nearby. I just can't.
What is wrong with us? We need to go back to freshman English.
Well, The Divine Comedy is one of those books, but there is an alternative where which was the obsession, right, of Red Dragon, the fictionalized character, right, in Thomas Harris, universe of books.
Paradise Lost.
Paradise Lost. That's right. Yeah, Paradise Lost.
Yeah, John Melton. So yeah, if you read Paradise Lost, the devil's the most interesting character, and he gets all the lines. He gets the good lines. So.
Well, and Paradise Lost is a text that continues to influence popular culture. It is sprinkled across Ridley Scott's film canon, particularly the Alien and Prometheus films in particular. They're obsessed with Paradise Lost. That was that not the title of his movie about Columbus as well? I mean, so it's the type of text that haunts the popular imaginary, especially in Western culture. And here we saw this in 1989. It's interesting, that movie has a little bit of rust on it now, that original Batman, and people start to look at it more favorably for, if you'll recall, the full soundtrack orchestrated by Prince, right? Later the artist formerly known as, right, who then became the artist symbol, who then became Prince, and then unceremoniously left us. So that was a movie that was playing with a lot of ideas. It's definitely in that era of peak Tim Burton at his most artistically creative and expressive, and he was able to follow it up. It is hard to follow up any great text with an equal or better work, right? And we know this. This is the ultimate trick that everyone has to perform when it comes to sequels or the follow-up book or what have you. And the catch-22 is, I'm in the camp that Batman Returns absolutely equals the original Batman. In some ways, arguably is superior to it. That is able to take it and elevate it in certain ways, but the mass appeal dropped off, and it has to do with marketing and capitalism, specifically the marketing to children. So you had these enormously successful toy lines coming out based around these grim and gritty stories and characters. But let's also remember, this was an age where the Aliens movies had toy lines, RoboCop had toy lines, right? The Terminator had toy lines. Hey,
RoboCop, where we get to see the main character shot 142 times in slow motion.
My gosh.
The rules were different back then.
They were. And you saw this new wave of what we now refer to as political correctness in the 1990s. Things softened. The economy got better, right? The Cold War was over. And so that softening, that plays a role in culture too. But Batman Returns was heavily marketed toward children, even if it wasn't made for children. So here's the most, my favorite example to bring up is the McDonald's Happy Meal line that featured, the Penguin, Catwoman, and the Batmobile, and so on. I still have those toys somewhere, right? A storage unit or something like that. The fantastic little toys. Problem was, it was a hypersexual film, right? It had like a lot of adult themes running through it, sometimes relatively overt. It was very seductive. This was Tim Burton. Both of his Batman features were very much neo-noirs. They were familiar with film noir. They were playing with those archetypes, and then just translating it into a very kind of colorful yet brooding superhero situation. And I think that's how he was able to strike a balance, right, between his weird style and then a respect for, German expressionism and that kind of classical film form. That helped those movies work, but it was too dark for Warner Brothers. And so they lightened the tone And just as this Batman series helped launch what we see as the superhero age of cinema, they actually killed it for a short period too, because by the end of that series, you had Joel Schumacher's just hideously cynical and overtly campy Batman and Robin in 1997. So this film series, that the 4 films that came out in that cycle, really demonstrate what we teach in genre studies as that film cycle arc, right? It went through a kind of, classical age, a revisionist age, and all the way down to, a kind of self-parody by that 4th film.
Yeah, it really is a kind of a classical progression that might be worth studying on its own. But if you watch Batman and Robin and consider how it's just a parodic representation of something that was taken very sincerely in the first one, because I guess that's what's left. Every time you restate the premise, every time you remake the movie, you carve out a little area that the next filmmaker is not going to want to try. They're going to try and get a different perspective on it, and you end up with all that's left is parody. You end up just making fun of sort of, or overdoing, over the top what you've already done before. And I think that CGI has contributed to this, and so because one way that we can do more is that we can create these entirely virtual environments that can be made up from the imagination, and sometimes too often those get inserted in place of any real narrative.
This Batman Robin, perhaps the only context in which it can be appreciated, other than sort of maybe like midnight screenings with certain sort of like ironic viewing practices, that kind of jam, would be to look at it clearly circling back around and emulating the 60s campy show down to its Dutch angles, which is my least favorite angle in all of film. I mean, I just want to rake my eyes when I see it overused. The neon colors, the absurdity of it all, and parodic as you suggest, in every way. A complete lack of realism or depth or human drama. It's all devoid by that 4th film. At the same time, Batman was thriving in its darker tone on another medium, and that was on television. In fact, back toward children once again. Batman the Animated Series comes onto the scene in the early 90s, 93, 94, just on the coattails of Batman Returns, the second feature. And so it borrows that tone and almost like that Danny Elfman-like Gothic musical score that's very throwback. It has an Art Deco kind of futurist 40s mise en scène to its animation style. They were animating it on charcoal, the 2D celluloid animation, and telling very mature stories for what was broadcast on Fox Kids in the afternoons for 3 years for its first 3 seasons. And then it was later picked up a 4th season that had the same creators, but has a different production, different animation style when it became part of the WB's Batman Superman Adventures, right? Because the WB, that channel that morphed into the CW as we know it now, they adapted from the same creative teams a lighter Superman the Animated Series, which is, both of those are excellent vehicles, by the way. And at the conclusion of them, they went on to produce Justice League for several seasons, which aired on Cartoon Network, and at a late time, right, at an evening, a primetime hour, and definitely walk that same line of mature storytelling with deep characterization, but stayed true to the sense of a wounded and a brooding Batman, which is clearly a mark of influence from The Dark Knight Returns. Well, by the time we get through the 90s, we had quite the earth-shattering event, at least in the US, but definitely economically on a global scale. in 2001, the September 11th attacks took place, and sort of shook the world. As happenstance would be, Frank Miller was in the process of writing and releasing a much sought after official sequel to The Dark Knight Rises. Okay, and the title of this work is The Dark Knight Strikes Again. And I don't think you have read this particular volume, Scott, which I believe was released as a 3-issue or 3-book series. Each book is actually almost 100 pages, so it has at least.
That's why I can't read that much. So
it has a length to it, is about all I can say. It is universally panned by readers, fans, critics, especially art, appreciators. It is about as cynical a follow-up as you can get. And, for someone that can kind of, sometimes we get into these conversations in a class setting about why study popular culture and what's it matter, why are we thinking so much about this, and who cares, and just let me enjoy it, right? These are very common, lay ways of looking at media and its impact. And I think one of our educational objectives in the communication, media, and ethics degree is that we're trying to at least help to equip students, as Kenneth Burke would say, provide equipment for living, equip students with an ability to unlock and be able to shift from passive modes of leisurely consumption to active modes of critical thinking with any media we encounter. It doesn't matter that we're talking about a Batman or a James Bond, right? The spy genre, or television. What matters is how we can understand the various parts and aspects of it, and the numerous layers of significance it plays in how we communicate and understand, our world. And so, all that being said,
let me add from a business perspective. This is exactly what you have to. This is a skill you have to be able to develop if you want to keep your business relevant or keep your product relevant. It's not enough to just passively say, "Oh, people like Batman, so I'll make Batman glasses and sell them to Burger King." It's understanding why and understanding how that's likely to change, because businesses change, everything is change. It's change every day, and if you're not prepared to understand why this has been successful and that hasn't, why the gritty Batman is appealing to people when the old moralistic Batman wasn't, then if you don't do that hard intellectual work up front to understand cultural currents, you're at a disadvantage in business. Increasingly in the United States, we are a service organization. We have more to do with servicing needs than producing products. And a lot of the products that we do still produce and that we lead the world in are intellectual, artistical, cultural products, like movies, like graphic novels, like regular novels. But these understanding what people will want, being able to capture through your observations and your analysis, the word we keep using, the zeitgeist of what's going on, is a big differentiator between business success and failure. Consider Steve Jobs. Everybody on the other side of Steve Jobs said that's not what people want when he said, "Hey, I bet we could sell people an electronic device that would hold all their music." And he was ridiculed because very few people understood that, heck yeah, everybody wants that. They weren't doing the necessary work to understand the demography, understand the desire, understand what was aspirational for people, what they wanted to be able to do. So there's nothing more relevant to very practical matters of business than this ability to culturally analyze what's working and what's not working in the broader culture.
Wait, you're saying that I should take my briefcases full of compact discs and then go and just push them all into some kind of little unit that I can carry around with me?
But yeah, so
and I would access that music?
I still have all my compact discs, by the way. I copied all of them off into the iPod. See, we can't even remember what that was anymore. I had the 8 gig iPod, so literally I had more music on there than I could listen to the rest of my life.
I thought of one more example here to tie it back into our conversation here, and what I was reminded of in listening to your description of the business nature of being able to predict and anticipate and react to. Sometimes it's reactionary. Sometimes business is very reactionary. In fact, not unlike Batman, a reactionary hero. But I mentioned how Batman 89 came on the scene and they couldn't have anticipated how big it became, right? This week, we had the reemergence of the term Bat-Mania. That's what 89 was like. So by 92, with the follow-up, with the first sequel, Batman Returns, I mentioned the shift toward youth marketing, and they went too young. They had the McDonald's Happy Meal toys, which proved to be a PR nightmare. And you can look this up. This is true. By the third film, corporate synergy is important, right? I want to be like Mike and all of that. So they still have a contract going with McDonald's, but this time, I forgot to showcase this. They had the collector's glasses, right, for Batman Forever. They had 4 collector's glasses. I've been teasing this in the backdrop throughout our series. One back here, it's been there all along, hiding in the shadows. But they had 4. I only ever had 2, I think. Anyway, what I do remember was by the time we got to that 4th film, it was a Taco Bell full color plastic big gulp type cup. And what does that tell us about that kind of cynical nature, not only of marketing, but even like, capitalism? The bigger, the more colorful doesn't always equal, a successful model of marketing that product. So they had to shut down, right? And we get to the 2000s, and this work was.
What year was Back to the Future?
84,
maybe
85.
That's the movie that always comes to my mind. Corporations are finally getting it. It's like, okay, here is a movie that's going to be a big hit with a certain demographic, and Zemeckis, I guess, was amenable to this because that is a movie that every frame is loaded up with. I mean, Pepsi wins hands down, but brands are actually written into the script and displayed prominently in anticipation of the way that they'll be positively related to that movie, and it's very, very famous and likable star Michael J. Fox. So.
Well, okay, and so perhaps you're referencing Back to the Future 2 when they go to the future, and it's entirely over commodified, right? And that was 1989, which the brilliance of that sequel is it was giving us a kind of a critique and reflection of the 80s, which was a very materialist culture, right? That's one of its reputational strands in the U.S. And so one of the ways we celebrate it too, I mean, it's both a point of critique and a point of celebration. This is exactly what Stranger Things does right on Netflix. Is it's giving us this nostalgia, but it's also reminding us of some of the absurdity of that nostalgia as well.
Them all. Who doesn't like them all?
Absolutely. Everyone apparently doesn't like. So,
hey, I also wanted to mention before we get too far past the year, you've got me reading Death in the Family, which is what year?
80, 89.
So this is the one where Jason Todd gets killed off by vote of the people. But this is very much about the geopolitical situation at the time with the Middle East. So you have you have Middle Eastern terrorists, and that word is used very freely. And the at this time it's Libyans or whomever, but they're that are the villains in the early part of the drama, and a lot of the action takes place in Beirut, which was a center of much violence at that time. So this is another way that these stories, these funny books, are relevant in the bigger picture. Is, you know, you've got 12-year-olds reading that comic book and developing a perspective toward other cultures and toward the geopolitical situation that is accurate in some ways and inaccurate in other ways. But it's more of an influencer for that young comic book reader than the nightly news, for sure, because they're not watching the nightly news.
I would say this, culture swings, right? It's cyclical. We know this, businesses know this, marketers know this, but culture itself is innately cyclical. And this is why certain things go out of fashion only to come back into fashion later. It is in some sense human nature. It's sometimes orchestrated, but other times organic. You have essentially, I could boil this down to this zeitgeist topic of 9/11, kind of capturing everything from our attention to our anxieties to our concerns to a sense of like wounded pride about our, omnipotence as a lone superpower in the world. And Miller's book is coming out at a time where he's trying to react in real time to it and reflect on the 90s, and neither is working. Whereas a film like Sam Raimi's original Spider-Man came out in 2002, we're hot on the trails of a lot of public mourning and serious reflection. And if you'll recall, they had a very controversial, one of their teaser posters was an extreme close-up of the Spider-Man mask with the Twin Towers reflected in the background. And there was a kind of removal, reinsertion of this as the posters. And they ultimately elect to leave in a scene with the Twin Towers in at the closing montage of what is a return to a very optimistic, very hopeful, and shiny hero, like a Superman, like Luke Skywalker in Sam Raimi's original Spider-Man, Tobey Maguire, Kirsten Dunst, and so on. And that was the blockbuster of the year, right? That was 400 million like domestic gross or whatever. Like that was the movie that captured the imagination again. And it was a very optimistic tone that set off this modern era of nonstop tentpole superhero films. That's what reignited it. Was the Spider-Man, was the Marvel move, and we still see Marvel's dominance today. And this book for Miller, Dark Knight Strikes Again, was a complete miss. It was out of touch with what people were asking for, looking for, but also it's one of those artifacts that if you're thinking about it in conversation with technology changes, this was an era where comics had been in bankruptcy. Marvel was in bankruptcy at the end of the 90s. And these companies were struggling with what the next paradigm shift was going to look like for them. You had comics not only just maturing story-wise, but the art was becoming extremely embroiled with a sense of realism, a hyper-realism, but realism nonetheless. And Miller takes an opposite approach to that in this book, and it's garish. We say cynical because it's like how there are many panels and pages that no backdrop, like no sense of continuity, and so it's so bedazzled in a sense. And again, how do you write the sequel to a masterpiece, the perfect book? You can't. And we see this time and again. But it wasn't the end for Miller because Batman Returns, right? And it wasn't the end of Batman's cycle either. But what helped reignite Batman's cycle? It was the return to the grim and gritty, street level roots. That's exactly what Christopher Nolan did in the mid-2000s with Batman Begins. he adapted, in essence, Batman Year One to the Batman Begins, and we saw that sort of origin tale, perhaps the best superhero origin standalone film that's been made. You know, and the problem we have in this genre is too often they keep trying to feel the requirement of starting with an origin movie, and it doesn't work for every hero, interestingly enough. And how do you balance that formula? And so this was an example where audiences were pulled back, and quite successfully, to the point that by the time we got to 2008, you know, The Dark Knight, the follow-up sequel, was massive hit, right? A top 3 hit, top 2 hit of the year. It you know, crosses this line between a popcorn movie and a film, and you know, the ironic legacy of Christopher Nolan's movies was that he built an insular trilogy that was a standalone trilogy that was so well constructed and executed that DC could only crumble in their many adaptations since, right? It's like, how do you then restart everything immediately and then yet keep so much of that ingredient, but what do you do differently? And I think that's part of what's plagued them in subsequent years. Well, no, in no small way, especially in The Dark Knight, we can see Miller's fingerprints. We see across the narrative. It's a narrative that focuses on Batman and Jim Gordon. I think Batman Begins and The Dark Knight do this. That's definitely pulling from Year One and Dark Knight Returns. But we're seeing other influences elsewhere when they return to the character for the Superman versus Batman, which we mentioned previously. They go even darker and even closer to the infamous, iconic showdown between Batman and Superman. So much as they're borrowing visual frames and recreating it on the silver screen. They're using dialogue, lifting dialogue. Nolan's films and the Zack Snyder sort of DC expanded universe, or whatever the E stands for, entertainment universe. And so we're seeing that constant adaptation being attempted, but everyone clearly appreciates going back to the Miller well, because they understand that it sparked, right, a cultural influence in a significant kind of way. And so then it becomes a point of, do we move completely away from it, or do we hug closer to it? And that's every artist's tension, I think, that they face when they approach a text like that now.
And you know, I think he did the same thing. Again, the other through line, even more so than Robin maybe, is the Joker, and the way that he takes on the Joker's brutal personality. And then, you know, we're nearly up to 2012 when, you know, I think that there's some connections never fully realized, but you know, there were the shootings in Aurora, Colorado, when at a screening of Black Knight Rises.
Yeah, this was The Dark Knight Rises, Nolan's third and sort of capper to the trilogy. And you had a mentally ill lone gunman.
Again, I don't know that anybody's established connection, but I think a lot of us noticed, you know, he committed this god-awful, brutal act at a Batman movie, and he had dyed his hair orange, and, you know, I just, and he had some mental difficulties, and one wonders how much he's acting out the Joker character in real life. He was also very smiley original. His mugshots and the way he appeared in court, he was you know, he was constantly smiling. And an interesting object of speculation there, the way that culture can trickle into even the most vulnerable in this society and encourage them to emulate in some ways. it should always give us pause to make sure that, you know, we haven't degraded into such a violent context that vulnerable people may be more, you know, susceptible. So.
Well, and without sounding self-serving, that's exactly a reason that we should be able to have deeper discussions about popular culture, about their influences, about their persuasiveness, to be able to dissect these, to understand their potential media effects on audiences. We understand that not every audience member is going to experience the text in the same way. Some you know, piece of art or literature might be, to use recently used phrase like a trigger for someone, or you know, access an aspect that's uncomfortable for them, whereas others, it helps shine a light on it for the first time. It helps them realize difference, distinction, dialogue, create dialogue, and it's certainly something we hope to have in our final episode upcoming, is a healthy dialogue about it. But before we kind of turn that page, this we've talked a little bit about out of continuity aspects in popular culture. Within continuity, The Dark Knight became like a go-to, an increasing influence on the characters' serialized stories. So let's remember, Batman has been continuously published by DC since 1939, right, in some book or fashion. And I believe there's as often as many as 8 different Bat books releasing on a given month. You know, and comics are released on a serialized monthly fashion still. Most people tend to just see the maybe collected volumes at bookstores or online, but they are still serialized in that way. And Batman took on more and more of a brooding character. Miller's take was quite influential, and DC was kind of starting to kind of move the character into that space, creating more of a present younger Bruce that was beginning to become more paranoid, less trusting of his Justice League compatriots. And it played out in very interesting ways that led to a lot of fruitful stories. And I think when that kind of narrative can unlock storytelling potential, it's a gold mine, and it's worth exploring that terrain. At the same time, not without its criticism, right? Some people don't want that dark and brooding take. They need something a little more approachable. I think that's always a concern, maybe thinking about this book, and a reason the Dark Knight Journal is so important is because we're getting feedback in real time from students. It's important to understand, you know, just like Miller's Dark Knight Strikes Again was a total miss in 2001, 2002, does Dark Knight Returns work well for us in 2020? Is it the kind of story that still gives us a lot, that's still teaching us something, that's engaging us without offending us? And I think that's important. You know, I read, you know, always take into consideration all factors as because we're looking at it from intellectual or educational perspectives. Is it complementing what we're doing in the direction we're going, or is it time? You know, I was wrestling with this as I worked through the end of the book, and we go through the essential replay, a fictionalized account of the New York City blackouts. And it's so dark. These people are turning on each other, and there's violence going on, and all of these types of social unrest is occurring. And my goodness, this week alone, now we're seeing riots again that were protests that are morphing into riots as a result of sort of acts of you know, police actions that kind of tipped that line and went into brutality that cost lives. And there's a lot of social unrest still. And does a book like this, is it serving its purpose to really help us hold the magnifying glass to society? Or is it hit us at a time where it's too much, it's too dark, and let's return to an optimistic book like a Superman text, right? We've had students.
I think ultimately the buying public directs the artistic effort, because they will signal, and we, like you say, it's cyclical. We see times when people want to only see musicals. You know, they desperately need something encouraging. You know, the ability to engage heavier drama, I think, is usually born out of a time of relative peace in other areas. You know, it's like all good literature. Uh, you know, a good film is cathartic in that it exposes our own sort of weaknesses and strengths to us. It makes us examine things that we wouldn't sometimes think about. Makes us you know, do the heavy intellectual work of thinking about other positions that we might take. But it's, you know, when people are in the Depression is a good example. You know, people were not really interested in heavy drama. They were interested in entertainment because their life was already too dramatic. If you've ever, I know you've seen Sullivan's Travels. The boy, the movie, I don't know, what was that, 30s? It was, but it was with Veronica Lake and
Sergeant York.
Yes,
Westerner.
But it's Preston Sturges directed that. But the film that he wants to make is "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou," which is stolen by the Coen Brothers for their film, set in the Depression as well. But the whole premise of the movie is, you know, he wants to make this dramatic, meaningful movie, but people don't want that. People want to laugh, and he comes to this realization that that's a good thing too. So I think there's this, you know, there's this pull and push and a yin yang with society and the entertainments that become popular. When we're relatively prosperous and at peace, I think we're often ready to tackle heavier topics, ready to think about these more difficult sort of messages. And then when things get really bad, people often, you know, what they want from their entertainment is relief. I think we've seen, you know, the superhero movies, the Marvel franchise, the DC less successfully so far franchise, we see that sort of fluctuation in response to what's going on in society.
It'll be interesting to see what directions it takes. And I, you know, concur with your cyclical nature. I believe it was Tony Soprano who said to his psychiatrist, Dr. Melfi, whatever happened to Gary Cooper, right? We were scrambling to think of his name here momentarily ago, but also his point, the ironic point of him saying that is, here is this just vicious and mean, but yet internal and psychological, almost intellectual, but too brutish, you know, mobster, reflecting back on lighter, more nostalgic times and brighter messages about America. And that's been our theme throughout the course. Our larger theme has been mythic media in America. And hopefully we've been able to, through the course of this series, the season of special topics, use Batman and use the Dark Knight Returns, not necessarily become cynical or negatively influenced by the text, but to use it toward our goals, our purposes of reflecting and understanding cultural change, these shifts. And ultimately, this equips us, as I said atop the episode, it helps us to be able to, you know, prognosticate in a way or anticipate change. As you said, just as the market changes, cultural tides will change, and we will wrestle with things. We're wrestling with a lot of issues right now. These are ongoing, and Dark Knight Returns remains so prescient because I think about the nature of cable news, and I talk about it all the time. I've all but stopped watching it, but I know how much it influences and impacts people, and it's so important to talk about what that is and what it means and what it does, because I think we have a society that's not only trained but craving information, and I think the danger is that information can easily become infotainment, which is exactly what the book shows us, Miller's work. And what we want to be able to do is parcel between healthy places for information and education, not just information, but education, because that is alongside many of the more ethical, decisions we can make in the daily. That is what helps move us toward that ideal goal of a civic democracy, of a civil society, and those the ambitions of what the American dream can mean, and ideally could mean for everyone, if it ever can. Scott, it's been great having you on this journey. I think we had one of our most fruitful conversations yet. It's exciting. And we're excited to have some silent observers here. We're grateful for that. The views suggest the audience is growing, and it's not necessarily falling on deaf ears. It's excellent exercise, even if it were falling on deaf ears. I'll look forward to connecting one more time for season 2 of Special Topics in Media Studies when we reconvene for our finale, our 6th episode. I have tentatively scheduled a round table of guests that will join us, a bat panel, as it were, who are going to talk about Batman. We're going to explore a different kind of theme with The Dark Knight Returns and Batman: scholarly influences, intellectual influences. So we'll take a gander at the world of Bat scholarship, of comics studies as its own emerging sub yet interdisciplinary field in the last 20 or so years. I think it can be an exciting conversation. Hope everyone checks that out. We'll take questions from them. If we have more live students again, we may hear from them. It'll be a great way to close out this season of Special Topics in Media in conjunction with Mid-America Christian University and our course, COM 4103, Special Topics in Media Studies. Thank you for joining us.
Special Topics in Media is a production in cooperation with Mid-America Christian University. Special Topics is produced by Garrett Castleberry, Executive Advisor Scott McMurray, Audio Engineer Will McMurray, Graphic Design Logo by Corey Fuller, Music composed by Austin Foster. Special Topics is produced in coordination with the Communication, Media, and Ethics program at Mid-America Christian University.